Hi there, I'm Chris, co-founder of GoodCourse, and welcome to this edition of The Interview, showcasing the experiences and thoughts of EDI leaders in the higher education sector and beyond. Today our guests are Alex Prestage, Head of EDI at Queen Mary University, and Steph Mckendry, Head of Access, Equality and Inclusion at the University of Strathclyde. Given the research and forward-thinking solutions coming out of the higher education sector, we believe it's really important to showcase the work going on relevant to building inclusive workspaces and societies more broadly, which is where our conversation today is going to be focused. But first, some introductions. My co-host is GoodCourse advisor, renowned EDI thought leader and author, Binna Kandola, who I'll hand to now for a quick introduction.
Thank you, Chris. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm Binna Kandola. I'm senior partner and chair of Kandola, a practice of business psychologists who specialise in diversity and inclusion, kind of looking at it from a psychological angle. Is that all right? I don't like talking about myself.
Perfect. That's perfect. That's okay. Thank you. And I'll hand to Stephanie first, if that's okay. A brief introduction to your current role, and then Alex will hand to you for that, and then I'll back into Stephanie for a more in-depth look.
So, hi, I'm Steph Mckendry. I'm currently Head of Access, Equality and Inclusion at the University of Strathclyde, which is in Glasgow.
Perfect. Thanks, Steph. And Alex.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex Prestage. I'm Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Queen Mary University of London.
Awesome, thank you all. So, Steph, let's start with you if that's okay. We'd love to hear a bit about, I suppose, your journey into the EDI professional world. What was it that caused you to have, I guess, interest and I presume some passion to join that sector, and how your journey first started?
I think I came into EDI really via widening access to higher education. So that was always my passion. Myself and my sister were the first in our family to go to university, and I was always really academic and kind of saw an academic career for myself. And I certainly enjoyed my time at university, but I did feel a bit like a fish out of water there. I moved from quite an isolated area in England to a big city, and nobody talked like me, nobody had cultural experiences like me, so I was really aware that maybe I didn't fit in. So whilst I was studying my PhD, I worked for the institution's widening access programs, going into schools, talking to young people who were a little bit more like myself about what university could do, the fact it could be transformational, and I decided at that point I wanted a career doing that full time rather than in academia as I'd seen it before. And so after I finished my PhD, I looked for roles within universities, initially working in the University of West of Scotland doing a kind of student support role, which to me worked within widening access, because it's about getting people into university but also giving them the skills they need when they're there, and really translating a lot of those unwritten rules, which again I think is quite like EDI work. So I did that for a while, worked at Glasgow Caledonian as a lecturer in academic skills. So that's again working with what you might class as non-traditional students. So there was lots of mature students coming into, I worked within nursing and midwifery, again giving them the skills to write essays, to do critical thinking, literature reviews and so on. And then moved to Strathclyde when I saw an opportunity to work directly within widening access policy and practice. So I moved there in 2014, spent a couple of years with the Scottish Government on secondment, working for the supporting the Fair Access Commissioner, Sir Peter Scott, again looking at widening access policy in the kind of national level. And then as an institution, we took the decision to bring together our Equality Diversity Office and our widening access team so that we could look at underrepresentation and disadvantage and really improving culture and inclusion across the intersections. You know, I'd initially been looking at socioeconomic disadvantage and social class, and this was an opportunity to look at other kinds of underrepresentation. And so I've been doing that role for the last couple of years.
it's phenomenal to hear your story, Stephanie, and where the similarities and where the differences are. Absolutely, I started my career, if you like, as an EDI practitioner from an academic lens as well. I call myself a lapsed or a reformed sociolinguist. I used to study language, identity, and what brought me to the academic discipline of linguistics and society specifically was like this curiosity, this fascination with the world, people, self, and how we all interact, what brings us together, what pushes us apart, and having a real social and public purpose to my research and the research of others. I got quite frustrated in linguistic fields that weren't applied, that weren't looking at social anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and I found that I almost didn't have a home in many conventional linguistic fields. So that kind of caught my eye and my interest and curiosity. I would absolutely say is part of my style as I call myself an EDI practitioner. I think we have similarities there. I distinguish between an activist and a practitioner. In that as an activist, you might identify issues within an institution or for an institution. You might challenge that institution, and absolutely there's a place for activism. But as a practitioner, you're leading that diagnosis. You're bringing to bear evidence, theory. You're applying that to the local context. You're helping make sense of that, and you're proposing interventions, solutions, and evaluating them. It's quite a different role for me, and that's something that I've held very close to me and had taught to me throughout my career. I started off in academia. I then moved into students' unions, which have always given me and coloured sort of my approach in terms of student engagement and staff engagement. It's not enough for me to just be doing good work, to be leading effective interventions if our staff, our students, our community, don't know about them or don't have confidence and trust in our institutions and our interventions. So my student union background, I spent 2 years at Sheffield Students' Union, which I adored, in helping student leaders to engage with issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. I then maybe sold out to the dark side, as many on the student union side would say, and went to King's College London. My life absolutely was not destined for Sheffield. I loved the city and my time there, but I moved to London and became a diversity and inclusion consultant. Binna, the tenuous link is that the diagnostics that you did at King's College London led to my role as diversity and inclusion consultant, as it was then, being created. So that I guess you can see the impact of your work there. So I was at King's for 4 years in 2 roles as diversity and inclusion consultant, where I really learned and turned my academic lens to practice and helping institutions challenge structural inequality. I then became a quality, diversity and inclusion manager and helped lead a team of EDI practitioners. I really learned that managing diverse teams, high-performing teams, is part of my practice as an EDI practitioner and leader. That developing people is part of what I love, and being a technical manager there. And then recently, in 2021, I moved to Queen Mary, where I continue to do that and lead the function across the university.
Wow, such a rich experience. It's wonderful, the two of you actually. It's absolutely fascinating. But would you both see yourself as academic practitioners then?
I think I was going to say I land somewhere in the middle. I wouldn't say I was one thing or another, maybe some sort of hybrid, but I think what I try to do is take the best of both worlds, so that you do want to theorise, you do want to evaluate impact, because I find with widening access and EDI that difficulty of, well, what works and how do we know it works? So it's really important that you go back to that academic side of things. But I can get a bit frustrated about things being too esoteric or written in a way that probably isn't meaning to be inaccessible, but is inaccessible and needn't be articulated in that way. So, and maybe lacks practicality or means to implement things. So I think bringing both those worlds together, you end up somewhere that can actually affect change.
And the things being, I mean, the language being esoteric, is that about the language that's used in universities to describe things, or I'm presuming that also means the way the universities are described to the wider public.
Yeah, I think it's both things. So when I used to work in academic development, so supporting students about study skills, we would always talk about academic literacies. So there is a literacy of the university, and that's at all levels. There's the literacy of the subject that people are studying, but there's also the literacy of university altogether. So do you have to go and matriculate? Have you ever heard the word matriculate before? You could just call it registration. So there's all of these, there's very ancient language, but then there's all of the unwritten rules as well. Are you supposed to clap at the end of the lecture? Will you look like a fool if you're the only one to clap? Those kind of unwritten rules are also a language in themselves. So it's about making those clear to people, and and in doing so, I think that shows some of the absurdity of it, and then that's where you can make those changes.
Absolutely.
So the everyday, like the language we kind of take, that universities take for granted, could in fact be an obstacle in and of itself. Yeah.
Hidden curricula. It's a really nice way of framing it. Sort of what are we teaching our students, our learners, without ever saying that to them? What are we implicitly saying? This is what it means to be a university student or to be an academic, or it's really interesting. I was listening to a brilliant podcast the other day around scientific objectivity, whether you believe in that or not, and how historically universities have built walls higher, have deliberately distanced themselves from society in an effort to seem and establish themselves as this objective source of truth and knowledge, and protectors and stewards of that knowledge. I don't believe that universities can continue like that in a modern contemporary society, that rather we are, our generation, our core purpose of knowledge, of education, is enriched by engagement with our communities and co-creation and partnership, rather than objectivity and being this ivory tower, having higher walls.
But just to play devil's advocate just for a moment, if you say, well, actually, the universities have this language they use, which and we kind of need to look at the language that how we communicate. But people could say, well, that's just being a bit patronising, isn't it? That we could explain this, and rather than saying, actually, you're going to find this really difficult, so I'm going to have to kind of put this in a way that you can understand. Go on, Stephanie.
Yeah, that's almost saying it's about dumbing down, I would say, and it isn't that. It's about being very clear in what you mean. So I think Alex's reference to the hidden curriculum is really important there. So you've got the curriculum, and it's being very clear about what the curriculum is, what the vocabulary of that is, and providing definitions. It's not saying don't use disciplinary specific language. It's just defining it really well. So there's that, but then it's the hidden curriculum is the bits that you don't say is happening, perhaps because universities are big institutions. People tend to spend their whole lives in them if they work there, and can often come from generations of that. They don't even realize it's hidden. It's just the world that they live in. So it's about us making clear to people, these are the expectations of a university student. This is the expectation of how you might talk to a staff member. Being really clear about those, and then also saying where those expectations are unfair. So it may be. So I think what happens with the hidden curriculum, for example, is that can be, if we move on to say trans inclusion, the hidden curriculum might say, if every lecture starts with ladies and gentlemen, the hidden curriculum is telling everybody it's a binary world. I'm assuming what gender you are, and you couldn't possibly be non-binary because I've only acknowledged two. The lecturer may not have intended to do that, but that's what's been taught by everybody in the room. So the more clear we are about what we're teaching and what's being learned, the more we can avoid those kind of assumptions.
Yeah, if you don't mind, we come back to that later because I know you've done a lot of research on this, haven't you? That's really fascinating. The point about hidden curriculum. Yeah, Alex, we're going to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Stephanie's brought it to life in beautiful multicolour. There are so many examples, and one that I discovered the other day, a really interesting case study at Queen Mary, was that we have very few, and we have increased the number of lab spaces that have wheelchair accessible benches. If we don't have wheelchair accessible lab benches, what are we saying? We're implicitly articulating that we don't expect a scientist or somebody that works in a lab to be in a wheelchair, to use a wheelchair to help their mobility and them to access campus. So yeah, really great example of how we can take a step back, like almost challenge our received wisdom, our perspectives. That's the academic mission of a university. It's part of what we exist to do, to challenge received controversial opinions and to really think and critically engage with what we're being told.
I have a question to ask, actually, given so great examples there by Steph. Your example, let's say, ladies and gentlemen, starting a lecture, and Alex on wheelchair access to lab benches. I guess one of the challenges we often hear in the space is really around how you identify different aspects of the, let's call it, hidden curriculum. These are obviously two particular examples, but what kind of things can you do, or have you seen done, or are you doing currently, that kind of make it more a part of the culture or the process, that actually things like this that have always been done this way, that actually perhaps shouldn't be done that way anymore, actually get noticed, and therefore change takes place, if that makes sense?
I think listening to your staff and students. It may sound very obvious that the lived experience of in sort of inverted commas diverse staff and students, their experiences and what they notice. One of the things that I try to do in the teams that I lead is when people come in, when they're a new starter, I get them to ask questions. I pay attention to the questions, the things that they notice. They're not institutionalized. They haven't received or been kind of conditioned into this hidden curricula yet. So when our staff, our students hit the ground running, when they're coming into our institutions, what are they noticing? Why are they noticing it? And what can they tell us about ourselves? There's the concept of ethnography maybe can be helpful here. What is strange? What what seems peculiar? And how can we, if needed, address that peculiarity or that unfamiliarity?
When you say ethnography, what do you mean?
So it's a methodology, scientific methodology of going into a community and exploring what initially, and it's not an uncontested field, but the idea of going into somewhere that you don't belong and looking at what is strange, what do you notice, what is peculiar, what is different, and describing that and seeking to understand what motivates these cultural norms, these behaviors, these discourses that strike you as a researcher, as a research participant in that community as weird. It has a background in colonialism, and I will absolutely note that was the defining feature of the field, but particularly it can still be employed in a helpful way in modern day society.
Yeah, I think especially because you're empowering those that are new to the institution, so you're centering the underrepresented there, who are then telling you it's really odd that you do that, or I didn't expect you to do that, or nobody told me that was going to happen. So I think it can be used in an empowering way. I also think universities have this amazing resource in their students, and Alex has worked through the student, working within student unions, shows that we often turn to. We've got amazing partnership with Strathclyde and our Students Association, but they have various networks and groups and sabbatical officers who are more than happy to come and talk to you about where those issues are, and they more often than not also have the solutions for them.
It's come a couple of times actually about the underrepresented. Who are we talking about?
Yeah, so I suppose it depends on the context, doesn't it? So where I would look at it within an institutional level, and then also on a regional level and probably a national level. So underrepresented within my context is where I would look at the population of the West of Scotland, for example, and then compare that to the population of our student body and our staff group, and where there are differences, would consider those groups underrepresented. So within Strathclyde, for example, there would be socioeconomic underrepresentation. We would have groups like care experienced people, so people who spent time in the care system are massively underrepresented within higher education, both as students and staff. And then you obviously have disability as well. There are fewer people with disabilities than you'd find in the general population.
Yeah. How about you? How about you, Alex?
Totally agree there. I think Stephanie and I both have backgrounds in very different institutions and parts of the UK, which in itself is like a richness there. I've kind of grown my career, particularly in London institutions, comprehensive universities. And I would go as far as even there are infinite degrees, like the nth degree of context and layers of this like onion that you can peel back and understand. Absolutely, the regional differences, the boroughs of London are hyper diverse and very different in the ethnic umbrellas. And when we talk about challenging the black and black Asian minority ethnic umbrella, BAME, BME, global majority, whatever language you'd like to use to capture that umbrella of people and experiences, that's no longer enough for many of our learners and many of the institutional inequalities that we face. We need to understand the experiences of black learners, of Asian students. So we need to really break that down and pick under the skin of an umbrella that has been helpful previously, but I think we're very much reaching the limitation of how far we can take that and what we can helpfully implement as a result of that evidence and that analysis. So absolutely, I've worked in institutions where black and ethnic minority students may even be overrepresented in specific disciplines. I've worked with dental schools that are 75% Asian, but the academic staff are 25% black and ethnic minority as a whole. So the key challenge, I think, and underrepresentation speaks to in universities, fundamentally, the people that are providing research, education, do not reflect the ethnic diversity, the gender diversity, the variety of abilities of the society that we serve and our learners.
And I think it's about the whole journey through as well. So you might have, again, if you look at particular ethnic minorities, it might not look like underrepresentation in terms of how many people come into a course, but following their routes through in terms of attainment and then onto graduate professions, that can be where there are suddenly there is underrepresentation again, and then you don't end up with professions that look like the people they're supposed to serve. So I think that's really important. But I tend to use underrepresentation as a phrase because it doesn't have any kind of stigma attached to it. You can end up talking about disadvantage, and there is it isn't the person that's necessarily disadvantaged, and that suggests that the institution's doing them a favour rather than accepting that we would be a better institution if we had lots of different kinds of people here. So there's no suggestion that there's something lacking in the person if you use that kind of phrase.
Yeah, I suppose underrepresentation is it's a number, isn't it? You can compare it to something. There's disadvantage. Is it more subjective? I don't. Maybe it's not. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I'm not an expert in the economics of it, rather, or the. Yeah. All right. How many people are there? I mean, what you're talking about is huge. Like in terms of a topic, it's massive. So how many hundreds of people do you have in your department?
So, what in terms of who's working?
Who's working with you? The team. How big is your team?
I think we'd all say not big enough. So we've got, I think we're just getting some new staff to come in to do a training role specifically, but about 15 people within.
Yeah, you've got 15 people. How about you, Alex? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a different remit in that my team are majority staff facing and working on staff experience. But generally, the teams that I've led in the past 2 organisations and roles have been between 10 and 15 people, and increasingly multidisciplinary, where we not only have EDI practitioners, experts, sort of project managers, leaders. We have data analysts. We have communication and engagement experts, people that understand the core concepts of equality, diversity, and inclusion, and can take that out to an audience, so that we're not just specialists in EDI. More and more, these teams and these functions are becoming complex.
Yeah. So you got this topic, which is huge, and you've got a limited amount of resource, like the people in your team. So how do you decide what you're going to work on?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. It's one of my favorites, and absolutely, I think one of the successes that I found in my approach and my work over the years is sort of honing that academic lens, and I'm keen to prioritize. You can pick a finite number of things. I use staff and student feedback, whether that's surveys, focus groups, workshops, sitting down and having coffee with student sabbatical officers or members of staff and your leaders. All of this is insight, is evidence that you can use to generate what I propose to leaders as policy problems. At King's, I worked with the team to create what we called our 4 stubborn issues for race equality. We could sit there and generate an action plan for any number of years with any number of action points that would just become unmanageable, and we wouldn't be able to resource. The universities always have multiple priorities. Different sectors always have multiple priorities. You can only progress what you can progress. So distilling our staff and student feedback and experience, we fundamentally asked our staff, our students, what core issues would have the biggest difference for race equality in your day-to-day experience at the university? They came up with many of the same things that your research has shed light on, Binna. Representation at a senior level, particularly within academic staff, having a language, a mutual language to talk about race and racism sensitively and being open to that conversation, microaggressions, micro-incivilities, and tackling those and updating our processes in order to account for more implicit forms of discrimination and bias. We're very good at doing the explicit stuff. And finally, addressing attainment gaps. And Stephanie's alluded to the difference between getting in and getting on, and how different types of different student groups have different experiences of higher education, particularly when we're talking about race equality. There are differential outcomes in terms of degree attainment that cannot be explained fully by prior attainment. So 2 students that are of different ethnicities, but have exactly the same A-levels or tariff scores when they come into the university, statistically, there is a gap between the degree outcomes that they will achieve nationally. And I think that's increasingly higher education is putting interventions in place and has really got the regulation around differential outcomes to make change. And a lot of universities are investing a huge amount of resource in making this change. But that's a big piece of it. So I kept banging on about these 4 stubborn issues. These are the 4 things we're going to change over the next 5 years. And leaders ate it up, because it was 4 things that they could be familiar with, that they could be conversant in, and that they could be confident that we were championing and we had an action plan behind it. So yeah, I take all of that evidence, I soak it up, I synthesize it, and hand it out. Something comes out the other end of the machine.
But part of that conversation, I love this actually, and a significant part of that evidence you're collating is when you sit down and have a conversation with somebody over a coffee.
Absolutely.
And why shouldn't it? Why shouldn't it be?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because then you're balancing that with everything else. So all the academic stuff we were talking about earlier, the research, and then it's kind of what would make the biggest impact to you, and why shouldn't that be part of that? Yeah, I sometimes think we miss, the simple stuff. The simple stuff sometimes I think we miss out on.
I mean,
I know you can. It's about weighting. It's about weighting that appropriately when you come.
Absolutely.
Feed it back to senior leaders.
Anecdote is evidence. It's hard to account for how you interpret that, but it's something that is very powerful, has impact in the way that you can bring it to life. Some of the most fundamentally powerful and impactful conversations that I've had on myself, my journey, my learning, my development as a practitioner, have been sitting down and going for coffee with someone. Whether that's a mentoring relationship or somebody that I catch up with once. There's collegiality.
Yeah. How about you, Stephanie? How do you determine what your priorities are going to be?
Yeah, I'm probably quite bad at this because I'm like, we've got to fix this, we've got to fix this. So yeah, it is about prioritizing. I think it was interesting what Alex was saying, because we did a similar approach with our equality outcomes. So this is something that institutions have to do periodically, is provide equality outcome reports and have action plans. And what tends to happen is that you end up, this is what we're going to do for gender, this is what we're going to do for race. So you're automatically siloing and setting targets that are fairly uninspiring. So what we did was we took a thematic approach that was intending to really help us look at the intersections. And so we had 5 themes across which to which we divided everything. So we looked at power, voice, belonging, safety, and representation. Because we said if you were a staff member or a student or anyone engaging with our university, if you felt that you had equitable power, you had a voice, you belonged, you were safe, and you were represented, that would pretty much solve everything. And then there's a narrative that you can talk around that, so you can then have conversations about why somebody might not feel safe in certain situations, or where I was really interested in getting into discussions about power dynamics, because they change all of the time, and that allows conversations about those really tricky places, like a PhD student who's also a paid researcher, and what's their relationship with their supervisor, and how that plays out across different protected characteristics. So that's been really successful for us, and getting people to be quite passionate about things as well, rather than, here's our action plan and here's our targets and KPIs and so on.
I totally agree with you, Stephanie. You've hit the nail on the head for me. One of the tenets that I hold very dear to me and try to lead with is we engage people with issues, not concepts. If we're talking about sort of, come and talk to us about race equality, it's very broad. It's very like, you generally engage people who care about race equality, who are already activated and care about that issue fundamentally. If you start talking about, we're going to talk, as you say, about psychological safety in the workplace or within the classroom, then different people can bring different perspectives, and you get that sort of Kimberly Crenshaw obviously coined the term intersectionality, but then you can talk about all these different groups, different people's experiences of, for example, psychological safety or a lack of, that you don't instantly, as you say, pigeonhole or silo particular groups or experiences, that you get much richer descriptive evidence and data, if you like, to work with.
I think actually on that, Alex, question for you. So earlier also mentioned how a typical EDI team has kind of evolved from purely EDI practitioners to being a more complicated beast, should we say, in terms of having data professionals, communication, engagement people, etc. And what you described there in terms of engaging people with issues, not concepts, is to make it more either accessible or emotive for a much wider audience. Could you talk a bit more about, I suppose, the role that those additional team members now typically play in actually taking, you take the input, the evidence, the action plan, the priorities, but actually taking that into practice and making an impact? What kind of role does that wider team now play in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a new approach for Queen Mary. It's something that we're testing. We've made an appointment. We don't yet have our people, culture and inclusion engagement manager is the role. We don't yet have them in post. I'm very excited for them to join. But it is a reflection of my experience over the last year at Queen Mary. We can do the most brilliant work, and if nobody knows about it, what is it for? So I was having many conversations, and our ambition is to be the most inclusive university of a kind anywhere by 2030. That level of commitment, of challenge, is really exciting to me. But we have some way to go. We acknowledge that, and I would go around the university. I would listen. I would talk to members of our community, and they'd say, "Oh, Alex, like we'd really appreciate this intervention or that intervention. Have you tried this or that?" And I'd sit there and I'd be listening and I'd be sucking through my teeth and I'd be like, yeah, we're already doing that. How does this person not know about the interventions and the work that we're already leading? So there was a visibility, a participation, and an involvement gap, and that for me is a failing of the way that we are approaching equality, diversity, and inclusion, and we're looking to challenge that and change that so that we'll have a practitioner, an engagement practitioner who doesn't work, I guess EDI practitioners work in depth of expertise and having technical expertise in a particular area in my team. This practitioner, our engagement manager, will have a breadth of expertise across the team. Are they going to be able to wax lyrical about the finite detail of each of those projects? No. Will they be able to help our technical experts to understand what are the 4 key messages, the 3 key messages, and the calls to action, what really matters and what's really going to land with leaders, with our community, with X audience? They then take that out and help people participate.
Steph, on your side, anything to add to that in terms of the Alex mentioned in terms of the wider engagement piece and actually bringing that to an audience with impact?
We had success. It was my colleague who was on the project with us, Dr. Matson Lawrence. So we had a project that was looking at trans inclusion. So we explored the experiences of trans and gender diverse students and staff in universities and colleges. And one of the things that was really clear was that there was just a lack of awareness about gender diversity, what it was like to be misgendered, why you might want gender neutral bathrooms, what kind of safety issues there were. But equally, those members of staff and students didn't feel comfortable and were too tired of having to do all the work themselves. So we really struggled with how do we have an authentic voice without putting all of the labour on the very people who are saying that they don't want to do it. So my colleague created these short animations. So we took the transcripts of our interviews where people were genuinely talking about their experiences, had them voiced by other trans and non-binary people, and then had those against very small animations that sort of 5 minutes long that talk about what it's like to be misgendered and what it's like to go into a class after you've been verbally abused on the street. And that we can then show to, so every time we do a session about trans inclusion, we don't need to ask a member of staff to come and talk about their experiences, re-traumatize themselves. And it's not for me to talk about it because it's not my experience. I'm not trans, so it's not fair to talk over people or for them. But those videos seemed like a really good way of us, in a safe way, kind of showing the lived experience of people. And they have always had a huge impact. So I think ways in which you can authentically show people what it's like so that they can begin to empathise, but without putting the labour on people from those communities can be really effective.
I was just talking about that that research into trans and gender diverse staff and students. 86, this is like nearly everybody, 86% of people in your research have experienced barriers related in education related to their identity. That's practically everybody. I've never come across a survey like it.
I know. No, it was. I mean, I suppose it wasn't a huge surprise to us because we'd been talking to people. But yeah, it's stark. And when you dug into it as well, so people were saying, "Yeah, I've had barriers, but it's not too bad." When you were talking through those experiences, they struck me as really horrific. It's just that often people were comparing how their experiences in higher education to school or on the street, and there it was so much. But that's physical safety that's a concern. It's people coming up to you, whereas in higher education, it's probably more the microaggressions, the kind of hidden curriculum stuff that's getting in the way of being able to make your way successfully through.
It's also about what it does to yourself, though, isn't it? It's kind of it's
and that kind of fear that people. Yeah, I think what really struck me is that sometimes it wasn't that something had happened; it's that it could. So particularly in college where you have to have a register every class, your fear that they might have the wrong name on that register, and then suddenly you're outed. It's not whether that happens or not; it's the anxiety that it might, and then how everybody would react to that.
Definitely.
I've read stuff that you've written, actually, Alex. You've talked about internalized internalized homophobia and kind of just that kind of sense of your own identity, but you're eating away at yourself.
Absolutely, and it's that fundamentally is what drew me to queer linguistics and understanding the self and others, and how specifically queer people engage with the world around us. I definitely recommend that the Trans EDU resources are phenomenal. I've been using them for years in my trans inclusion training, because as Stephanie says, they bring voices that otherwise would not get an opportunity to be in the room into a space that colleagues who don't understand, don't have confidence to maybe ask those questions. Sort of fundamentally, one of the first things that people say when I get them in a room to conduct or to participate in trans inclusion training, they go, I just don't want to get it wrong. I'm scared of getting it wrong. And having resources like that bridge that gap, that provide a safe, welcoming area, like environment that people can be vulnerable and can ask those questions. One of the fundamentals for me is meeting people where they're at, and I say, articulate this however you can right now. We will use that as a learning experience, even if you say something that is unpreferred or isn't how I would articulate it. I would describe to you why I would say something different, or maybe how that could be understood or misunderstood, so that person and the rest of the group learns from that. And that's always been a well-received approach.
Yeah. What does that mean, meet people where they're at?
Well, I think it recognizes that each of us is on a journey, and there's no sort of crucible. There's no one person that can be excellent across all these axes of diversity and without flaw. It recognizes that each of us have different personal experiences, lived experiences, and that nobody's going to know it all. That we are on a journey, those that wish to participate and go along on that journey to learn more about others, to learn more about different ways of living, being, different selves, different versions of the self, and that's a process, that nobody does that overnight. As we were saying earlier, some of the best and most enriching conversations we've had around the development of our work and ourselves has been over coffee. Sorry, I don't understand the concept of pronouns. Right, let me take you for coffee and we can talk that through. Like, I could do that in 45 minutes, and you'll be able to tell you'll be able to tell somebody else how to do that next. I'm a firm believer in the power of mutual and reverse mentoring. And at a previous organization, I was matched with a senior leader who was particularly curious, but underconfident in the trans inclusion and LGBTQIA+ inclusion space. Race equality, gender equality broadly, he was more and more confident with and was familiar with the issues, but he was like, I just don't get the trans stuff. Can you talk me through it? Can you sit me down? And we had really impactful mutual mentoring sessions once a month. We popped in 45 minutes and we both talked about our careers, our identities, what that meant for us and other people's experiences. And we got a very long way in a very small number of time and I guess investment.
Really good. Yeah, and your point is that person then can actually go away and have conversations of their own, like the one you just had with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is multiplier effect. Yeah.
I'm unfortunately conscious of time because there's actually a fascinating conversation, but everyone's got, I'm sure, plenty of the day to crack on with. But Steph and Alex, thanks so much firstly, but a final question to pose to you both. If you can give a suggestion in a single sentence or two, if someone is looking to embark on their career as an EDI professional, what would you recommend to them? Alex, you first, on the spot.
Here we go. So I definitely cite the working out what it means to be a practitioner, and I think the earlier conversation there is helpful. I think what I take with me and try and encourage my teams to understand the network that I have is not everything is a jury on your worth. And to me, that speaks to, I could have the most brilliant briefing, I could be my absolute best, and for whatever reason, circumstances will conspire and I won't get the outcome that I want or that I feel is right for the organization. That's part of the journey. I've been in places and positions in my career where I thought I failed, and actually it wasn't about me. And I think because so many of us as EDI practitioners and activists come to this from a personal lived experience angle, it can feel very personal. Sure. It's not.
Got it. Thank you, Alex. And Steph?
Yeah, I think I would say work out what your skill set is and what it is you like doing, because as Alex has said, there's a whole range of roles with an EDI remit now. So you don't necessarily have to be the practitioner or the trainer. It can be that perhaps you like the research side of things and you like drawing on the evidence. So look for roles around that. I think also draw upon, as you said, people come with lived experience and they can have that passion and emotion, and that's a good thing. I think it took me a long time to realise you can actually bring yourself to it, and you don't have to put all of your story out there. You don't have to put any of it out if you don't want to, but it's okay if you do, and it does have an impact.
Okay, Chris, can I just add something?
Of course you can, Binna.
I've been listing the actions that Alex and Stephanie have been coming up with, and I thought actually this isn't your typical list of actions you get to know how to develop an equality and diversity strategy. One of the first I wrote down was about listening to your staff and students. I've got lots of other things here, but actually but listening to people and actually and for the students in particular, what is it? Well, the staff as well, actually, who may be underrepresented, but what's their experiences and trying to see it from their point of view. Taking this thematic approach, so the 5 themes that I mentioned: power, voice, belonging, safety, representation, and using that to kind of work on the culture in the organisation. Using your students, they are an amazing resource. Engage with issues, not concepts. Have a sense of ambition. So, Queen Mary University is actually the most inclusive university by 2030. Actually, when you're doing your communication, just be imaginative. So, Stephanie gave the example about the animation that was produced. But also, Alex was mentioning about spaces where people can talk and actually have these conversations. Learning, so review what you're doing, and both of you actually mentioned about things. Yeah, this worked well. Actually, you know what? Some things didn't work so well. We reviewed. We've learned from the experience. We modified. Sometimes we've changed. Completely. Mutual mentoring, where you can learn, and actually it's an easy way. It's a warm way of doing it, where people can learn from one another. And this idea about meeting people where they're at and kind of having a conversation so don't underestimate those things. You never get that in how you develop a strategy in a higher education establishment. You would get some of that, but you'd never get all of that. Some of those things I've never heard before. I just thought what's worthwhile just sharing that, actually, because I think there's an immense amount of wisdom that was shared today. Yeah.
Maybe we should start a university by ourselves.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, Alex, Steph, Binna, thank you. I'm sure everyone watching will agree it's been a really interesting and important conversation. Lots to unpack and lots more to discuss if we had time. That's it for this instalment of The Interview. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.